On the evening of June 10th, 1986, Sue Snow climbed into her backyard hot tub in a small suburb outside of Seattle, Washington. The water felt amazing, so Sue told her two daughters to come join her. The girls came over and jumped in the hot tub with their mom, and immediately they began laughing and splashing each other. And right away, it reminded Sue of when her daughters were actually really young. In reality, her daughters were not little kids anymore. Her oldest was home from college for summer, and her youngest was already 15 and would head up to college herself in a couple of years. So as a result, Sue cherished moments like this, when life just sort of felt simple again. And tonight actually felt even more special than normal, because Sue had actually been so busy at work lately that she'd barely gotten to see her girls at all. Sue was a vice president at a bank, and she had just landed a $5 million account that afternoon. This was a huge accomplishment, but it had taken a toll, with lots of late nights and very stressful meetings. Just then, Sue's husband, Paul Webking, came outside with some soda and champagne, and Sue looked up at him with surprise. Paul grinned, handed the soda to the girls, and poured Sue a glass of champagne. Then he raised his own glass to make a toast. He said he knew Sue didn't like to talk about her accomplishments, but he was so proud of her, and she deserved to be celebrated for closing such a huge deal at work. The girls cheered, and Paul leaned in to give Sue a kiss. Sue smiled, and she knew that if right now somebody took a picture of this moment, she and Paul would look like the perfect couple. But the truth was, their relationship had been strained for quite a while. 9 months ago, Paul had made a terrible confession. He'd cheated on Sue with an old girlfriend. He swore it only happened once and that it didn't mean anything, but Sue had been absolutely crushed. At the time this happened, she and Paul had been together for 8 years. They were talking about getting married, and Paul looked after Sue's daughters like they were his own, and so Sue wasn't ready to throw all of that away. So they'd started couples counseling, and just 2 months after Paul's confession, they had an impromptu wedding. Sue hoped this marriage would actually fix their relationship. But truthfully, Sue had never been able to shake the fear that Paul's cheating had not stopped. Paul was a long-haul trucker, which meant he spent days and days at a time on the road. And ever since he confessed to cheating on her, Sue spent the entire time he was gone wondering who he was with. The sound of her daughter's laughter stopped Sue from spiraling further into these intrusive thoughts about her husband, and her attention snapped back to her family. They spent the evening talking and laughing together, and Sue reminded herself to focus on all the positive things she had in her life. And by the time she climbed out of that hot tub that night, she actually was in a good mood again. But the next morning, Sue woke up with a pounding headache. Unfortunately, the stress from work and her constant concerns about Paul had made these morning headaches all too common. Paul had already left for work, and her oldest daughter had spent the night out with her boyfriend. So Sue rolled out of bed and walked down the hall to say good morning to her youngest daughter, Haley, and then after that, she went right to the medicine cabinet in her bathroom. She grabbed a bottle of extra-strength Excedrin and washed down 2 pills with water from the sink, hoping this would get rid of her headache. A little later that morning, Haley stepped out of the shower in the other bathroom. She wrapped her towel around herself and then opened the door to go back to her bedroom. But she heard something strange. The water in her mom's bathroom sink was running, and she thought she heard water splashing onto the floor. Haley called out for her mother, but she didn't get an answer. So Haley walked down the hallway, and as she did, the sound of running water got louder, but she couldn't hear her mom moving around or anything. Haley approached her mother's bathroom door, which was slightly open, and through the crack, she saw that the tap water was on and the sink was overflowing with water. Haley rushed in to turn off the water, but then she saw something on the ground and she just screamed. Her mother was crumpled on the floor in her bathrobe with her back up against the bathtub. Sue's eyes were wide open and her fingers were curled up like she was trying to grip something that wasn't there. And so after a second of screaming, Haley stopped and bent down and checked her mother's pulse because she couldn't tell if she was even alive. And she found her mother's pulse was there, but it was faint. In a total panic now, Haley turned off the water and then ran to the phone in her mother's room, but she wasn't really thinking clearly, so instead of immediately calling 911, she called her mother's friend. When the friend heard what was going on, she told Haley to call 911 right now, and the friend said she'd be over in a second. A few minutes later, the friend and the paramedics arrived, and Haley, who was totally upset, led them all to the bathroom where her mother was. The paramedics quickly examined Sue and began pulling off her robe to check for hidden injuries, and as they did, one of them asked Haley if her mother had a history of drug use. And Haley shook her head and said no, she sometimes took over-the-counter drugs, but that was it. Meanwhile, Sue, despite having a light pulse, was still completely unresponsive. and so the paramedics put a tube down her throat, they lifted her onto a stretcher, and then ran with her back through the house out the front door, with Haley and her mom's friend following behind. The paramedics loaded Sue into the back of the ambulance and told Haley that her mom would need to be airlifted from the local hospital to a bigger hospital in Seattle, and Haley would need to find her own way there. Then they shut the ambulance doors and sped off with the sirens blaring. Haley stood in her front yard in a total daze. Her mother's friend put her hand on Haley's arm and told her she would drive her to the hospital, and she also asked Haley if there was anyone else she could call. And that was the first time since Haley found her mother on the bathroom floor that she thought of her mom's husband, Paul. Paul was loading his 16-wheeler truck in the back of a big industrial warehouse when one of his coworkers came over to him looking panicked. The coworker said Sue's friend had just called dispatch and told them that Sue had been rushed to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. Paul immediately put the box he was holding down and asked his coworker, what else do you know? What else did Sue's friend say? But the coworker just shrugged. Sue's friend hadn't given any more details than that. So Paul gave up on loading his truck and just ran out to his own car and began driving towards the city. But as he drove, he was more confused than worried about Sue. He knew that lately she'd been having a lot of anxiety, and since Sue's friend had not mentioned a car accident or any kind of big injury, Paul kind of assumed that Sue might just be having a big panic attack. But 15 minutes later, Paul walked through the doors of the emergency room and he saw Haley's pale face, and he knew that whatever happened to her mother was not just a panic attack. Paul asked Haley what was happening, and she blurted out, "Mom's brain dead," and then she began crying. Paul stared at Haley in shock. This didn't make any sense. When he left that morning, Sue was in bed sleeping peacefully, totally fine. But Haley obviously knew more than he did, and she was hysterical, and so with a sinking feeling, Paul realized something horrible was really happening. This was real. And so as his heart rate sped up, he tried to catch his breath, and then he just pulled Haley in tight for a hug. A few minutes later, Paul tracked down the doctor outside of Sue's room in the intensive care unit, but the doctor didn't have much more information than Haley did. He said that unfortunately, Sue's brain had been starved of oxygen for so long that she would never wake up again. But he said the medical staff could not figure out why. Essentially, Sue was a healthy 40-year-old woman, except for the fact that she was now suddenly brain dead. Then, in a soft, comforting voice, the doctor said now there was only one thing left to do. Paul was going to have to decide when to take Sue off of life support and let her die. Paul just stood there staring at the doctor like he couldn't even process what he was just being told. And then finally, he just asked the doctor if he could please go see his wife. The doctor nodded, and as Paul walked into Sue's room and saw her laying there connected to all these tubes and wires, he wondered how in the world he was going to find the strength to make this terrible choice. One day later, the medical examiner put on a pair of rubber gloves and walked up to the metal table that held Sue's body. Paul had waited until Sue's older daughter could make it to the hospital to say her goodbye to her mother before Paul gave the doctors permission to take Sue off of life support. And so now, the medical examiner had to solve the mystery of why this seemingly healthy woman had suddenly collapsed and died just 5 hours later. An assistant took notes as the medical examiner narrated her findings, but she was as baffled as the hospital staff. Sue had not had a stroke, aneurysm, or a heart attack. She had no broken bones, no skull fractures, and no internal bleeding. And a drug panel showed she had not overdosed on any of the more common street drugs like heroin or cocaine. So the medical examiner began to think that her only hope of solving this mystery would likely come from the full toxicology report, which would take several more days to complete. But then suddenly, the medical examiner's assistant stopped taking notes and interrupted the medical examiner mid-sentence. The assistant asked if the medical examiner smelled something strange. The medical examiner shook her head and looked at her assistant confused. The assistant wrinkled up her nose and took in a big inhale, and then nodded with certainty like, "Yep, I smell something." So the medical examiner did the same thing and breathed in deep through her nose, and immediately her eyes went wide. The odor was faint, but it was very clear. Sue's body definitely smelled like almonds. In all her years of performing autopsies, this medical examiner had never seen this before. And so even though she now had a theory as to what happened to Sue, she was already kind of questioning whether that could possibly be true. I mean, this only ever happened in movies or detective novels. But she still made a special note to check for one more chemical on Sue's toxicology report, because cyanide has a telltale smell: almonds. 5 days after the medical examiner sent Sue's blood off to be tested, Detective Mike Dunbar from the local police department was about to pop some bread in the toaster for breakfast when his phone rang. Dunbar answered, and his sergeant quickly told him to cancel whatever plans he had that day because he was catching a new case. A woman named Sue Snow had been murdered, and before Dunbar could say anything, his sergeant said her toxicology report showed that Sue had been poisoned with cyanide. Dunbar was so shocked he had to ask the sergeant to repeat himself to make sure he heard correctly. Any murder in the quiet Seattle suburb where Sue lived was totally unusual, but cyanide poisoning sounded like something out of a movie. But the sergeant said, yep, there's no doubt about it, it was cyanide. He said the medical examiner and her assistant had smelled almonds during Sue's autopsy, which is a sign that perhaps this was cyanide, and then sure enough, when they sent off her blood, it came back positive for cyanide. Sue had a lethal dose in her system. The sergeant reminded Dunbar that cyanide was a fast-acting poison, and there wouldn't have been more than a few minutes between when Sue ingested it and when she collapsed. That meant that Sue must have come into contact with whatever poisoned her inside of her house, because she collapsed in her bathroom. So the sergeant gave Dunbar the family's phone number, and then the two hung up, and then Dunbar immediately called the family's house. After a few rings, Paul picked up with a very distracted-sounding hello. Dunbar introduced himself, but Paul barely seemed able to hear him. And then eventually, Paul actually just cut Dunbar off and apologized and said, I can't talk right now because I'm about to leave for Sue's burial. But Dunbar told Paul that unfortunately, the news he had could not wait. He told Paul Sue had been poisoned, and Dunbar needed to come to their home as soon as possible to look for whatever had killed her because it could still be in that house, which means the family could still be at risk. Paul was completely silent for a minute, and then he told the detective that, that's shocking, but still he would need to talk to him later on because of this burial. So Dunbar kind of resigned to the fact that Paul was not going to budge on this, told Paul to please gather Sue's family at his house after the burial, and Dunbar said he would come by to talk to them and also search the place to make sure there was no more poison in their house. At this, Paul just kind of mumbled that he'd do his best, and then he hung up. Later that day, Detective Dunbar arrived at Sue and Paul's house, and when he got there, he saw the other detective who was going to help him with the search of the house. Then the two of them walked up to the front door, and Dunbar knocked on the door, and as they waited, Dunbar turned to his colleague and warned them that the family had just come back from Sue's burial, so the mood was going to be very sad and heavy. However, when Paul opened the door, upbeat music was blasting from the stereo, and Dunbar could hear people laughing inside the house. Paul smiled and welcomed the two detectives inside, and he told them that instead of having a gloomy wake, he decided to hold a celebration of Sue's life. He said being sad and crying really didn't help with anything. Dunbar nodded politely, but he shared a quick, suspicious look with the other detective. This was not what either of them had expected at all. Paul pointed them to the bathroom where Sue had died, and he told the detectives that the family had not touched anything inside of there at all. Dunbar then gave Paul a form asking for consent to search the house, and Paul signed it right away. But before the detectives got started, Paul told them he had one question. Dunbar nodded and looked at him intently, curious to hear what this question was. Paul then held up a menu and said he was ordering pizza, and his question was, "Do you want any pizza?" Dunbar knew people grieved in different ways, but he could not get over how relaxed Paul seemed. But he thanked Paul for the offer and said no, they didn't want any pizza, and then they headed down the hall towards the bathroom. Dunbar put on rubber gloves and then stepped into Sue's bathroom and went right for the medicine cabinet. One by one, he took out bottles of prescription medication and over-the-counter pain pills and carefully dropped each one into its own evidence bag. As Dunbar worked, the other detectives searched the rest of the house, looking for anything stored in the closets or garage that in theory could contain cyanide. When Dunbar finally finished in the bathroom, he walked back to the kitchen and he found Paul sitting quietly at the table. By now, most of the guests had left and the music had been shut off and the pizza was getting cold on the counter. Paul seemed to have lost all the energy he'd had when Dunbar and his colleague had first arrived. Dunbar saw an opportunity here, and so he sat down and just began asking Paul questions about where he had been and what he was doing on the morning Sue had died. Paul told Dunbar that he'd left for work before Sue had woken up, and then later that morning, he learned that his stepdaughter, Haley, had found Sue on the bathroom floor. Paul's voice sounded very tired, and his story was very to the point, without any of the extra details that could sometimes indicate a person was making things up. Dunbar wondered if maybe he'd misjudged Paul. Maybe Paul's oddly excited demeanor from earlier was really just his attempt to cope with overwhelming grief and shock. Of course, Paul might also have realized he'd made a very bad first impression on the police, and so maybe now he was just trying to backpedal and act really upset, like the way they would expect him to. So Dunbar wasn't really sure what to make of Paul. After asking Paul a few more questions and feeling satisfied that Paul had told him everything he knew, Dunbar thanked Paul and then excused himself to go talk to Sue's daughters and the other family members who were still in the house. But when he spoke to them, they all seemed totally drained, and none of them really had anything new to share. And so at this point, Dunbar understood that really there was only so much progress he could make without knowing what exactly had poisoned Sue. So he and the other detective thanked the family, they gathered up all their bags of evidence and left to go turn in everything they had found to the lab. At 8 p.m. that night, Detective Dunbar was back at home relaxing by himself when his phone rang. It was a scientist from the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA for short, which is the government agency responsible for ensuring that food and medicines are safe. Dunbar had sent all that evidence he collected at Sue's home to the FDA for testing, but he definitely had not expected a callback so quickly. The FDA scientist told him on the phone that this was a very urgent matter. They had found the source of the cyanide. It was in the Excedrin painkillers inside of Sue's medicine cabinet that she was taking for her headaches. Someone had replaced the powder-filled Excedrin gel caps with gel caps that were filled with cyanide powder. Of the 56 pills that were still inside of the bottle, 7 more contained cyanide. And suddenly, Dunbar knew exactly why the FDA had 1, tested everything so quickly, and 2, reached out to him right away. The implications of these pain pills containing the cyanide was that perhaps Sue was not like a targeted killing. Perhaps the murderer or murderers walked into a pharmacy or multiple pharmacies and just slipped poison pills in with the over-the-counter pain medication. And if that's what happened, there was no way to know if just 1 bottle had been poisoned, or if there were more poison pills out there either still waiting on store shelves or in unsuspecting people's medicine cabinets. Like, this could be a full-blown national emergency. And this was actually not the first time something like this had happened before. Just 4 years earlier in Chicago, Illinois, 7 people had died after taking cyanide-laced Tylenol they bought in their local pharmacies and grocery stores. When news of the deaths had broken, there was a national panic, and despite the intense investigation that followed the Chicago Tylenol murders, the killer had never been caught. Now, Detective Dunbar realized that the Tylenol killer may have just struck again, or he could be dealing with a copycat killer. Either way, if this killer really was murdering at random through these poison medication bottles, well, figuring out their identity would be very difficult, if not impossible. Dunbar thanked the FDA scientist and hung up. Then he immediately called the chief of police and let him know they might have a large-scale incident on their hands. The city was going to have to put up some kind of an alert. But even though Dunbar realized this case could be on the scale of the infamous Tylenol murders, he wasn't totally convinced that somebody had tampered with Sue's Excedrin in a store. The more simple explanation was that this was not a random murder, that somebody who knew Sue, who had a reason to kill Sue, specifically put cyanide pills in with her Excedrin pills. And if that was the case, Dunbar thought Sue's husband Paul was the most likely suspect. So Dunbar called Paul and told him that it turns out it was specifically the Excedrin that had killed Sue. That's where the cyanide was. And in a calm voice, Paul replied to this by saying that he was not surprised. Dunbar was so shocked by Paul's answer that he just kind of fell silent for a second. He couldn't understand how Paul could have thought the Excedrin was poisoned unless he was the one who poisoned it. Then suddenly, Paul began stammering, and he told the detective that, oh my goodness, I've taken 2 of those exact Excedrin pills myself. I could have died. And then Paul began to hyperventilate over the phone. But the whole thing felt a little too theatrical for Dunbar. For Paul to go from not even being surprised about the Excedrin to suddenly panicking that he could have been a victim himself just felt very performative. So Dunbar asked Paul if anyone had seen him take those Excedrin pills. If this really was Paul's story, Dunbar wanted him to prove it. But Paul, who was still hyperventilating, said no, he was alone when he took the pills. However, this only added to Dunbar's suspicion of Paul. The next morning, when Dunbar grabbed his newspaper off his porch and read the headlines, he grimaced. There on the front page in big letters was the announcement that Excedrin had been recalled across the entire country. Dunbar knew the recall was the right thing to do, but he also thought this was going to spark public hysteria. And when he arrived at the police station later that day, he he knew he was right. The station was absolute chaos, with a line of people at the desk. Some of them were yelling out their theories, and others were crying because they were worried they'd taken poisoned Excedrin, even though if they had, they'd already be dead. But they didn't really know that, so they were just totally losing their minds about it. But it wasn't just civilians that were clogging up the police station hallways. An entire busload of FBI agents had descended, and Dunbar watched them setting up a command post in a big conference room. Dunbar pushed his way through the crowd of hysterical people and made his way to his desk, where he found a special agent named Ike Nakamoto waiting for him. Nakamoto was a big, serious-looking guy, but the moment he saw Dunbar, he smiled and shook Dunbar's hand and apologized for the mess. Dunbar had heard stories about how the FBI liked to order local police around, and so he was immediately suspicious of Nakamoto's friendliness. Nakamoto explained that the FBI had been called in as soon as the FDA realized it was the Excedrin that was poisoned. He said that after the Chicago Tylenol murders, the FBI had been given jurisdiction over any investigations that involved poisoned medication. But Nakamoto assured Dunbar that the FBI was there to focus on the product tampering angle, not to take Dunbar's murder case away. Nakamoto said he wanted the detective to continue to investigate Sue's death, and they could even work together and share information. Dunbar managed to smile and said he'd be happy to work together, but he said he still thought the killer was much more likely to be Sue's husband, Paul, than some anonymous poisoner. Paul just seemed off. It was like he was always either underreacting or overreacting, like a guilty man trying to say and do the right thing, rather than an innocent, grieving man reacting to events as they happened. It all just seemed very performative. Paul just kind of seemed like he was acting. And to Dunbar's surprise, Nakamoto nodded and agreed with him. The FBI was discussing all the possibilities, including the idea that, perhaps the Chicago Tylenol murderer had struck again, but they also thought, a local killer here was much more likely. Nakamoto said the FBI was only here to make sure nothing got missed. All day long, FBI agents flooded local pharmacies and grocery stores, taking more than 15,000 bottles of Excedrin off shelves and out of storage rooms and sending them out for testing. And while that was happening, people kept filing into the police station looking for answers. But by the evening, things had finally quieted down around town and at the station, and Detective Dunbar was exhausted and ready to go home. So he picked up his car keys and headed for the door, but right as he was about to leave, Nakamoto stepped out of the room the FBI had taken over and yelled for him to wait. Then Nakamoto rushed over to Dunbar and told him the FBI had just gotten a call from the lab, and they had found another cyanide-laced bottle of Excedrin at a grocery store. Dunbar just hung his head. This meant somebody was almost certainly poisoning medicine at random, likely in the pharmacies or in the grocery store, and this also meant Paul was not nearly as obvious a suspect as Dunbar thought. Now, the killer could be anyone. The next morning, Dunbar arrived back at the police station, thinking his role in the investigation was over. It seemed pretty clear that the killer was poisoning bottles at random, which was way beyond anything Dunbar or his small police department had the resources to handle. But as a team of FBI agents headed out the door to interview people at the grocery store where that second tainted bottle was found, Special Agent Nakamoto approached Dunbar and told him he wanted to keep their two parallel investigations running. Nakamoto said the second bottle could just be a decoy, so the FBI would pursue the theory that the killer was a random poisoner, but Dunbar should keep his investigation alive, looking into Sue's life, in case the killer was connected to her. Dunbar felt rejuvenated, and the first thing he did was head right to the bank where Sue worked. He still wasn't sure what to make of Paul, and so he figured maybe Sue's co-workers could give him a fresh angle to pursue. Dunbar walked into the bank, and the atmosphere was quiet and stuffy. He worried that Sue's co-workers might not open up. But he asked a woman working behind one of the desks if she'd be willing to answer some questions about Sue, and the woman's face lit up. She immediately grabbed Dunbar's arm, pulled him into an empty office, and began gossiping like they were old friends. She said that Sue was very flirtatious and had a hot temper. One time, somebody Sue went to lunch with had even left an angry note on Sue's desk afterward, accusing her of being promiscuous. Sue always claimed that her flirting was not cheating, but the coworker had always wondered if maybe Sue's behavior really bothered Paul. And she said there was more. People close to Sue knew Paul had cheated on Sue, and so they theorized that maybe all of Sue's flirting was Sue's way of getting back at Paul. Detective Dunbar thanked Sue's coworker, and then talked to a few more people at the bank, and then headed to the station to inform Nakamoto that Sue and Paul's marriage might have been way more strained than anybody realized. But when Dunbar got to the station, Nakamoto was waiting on the steps with 2 coffees in his hands. he handed one to Dunbar and told him he had big news. Now, most of the people who had called into the police station worried that they or their loved ones had been poisoned by Excedrin that was laced with cyanide were people who were just reacting to headlines and being paranoid. But it would turn out one of them was right. There had been another death from cyanide poisoning in town, and it happened 3 days before Sue's death. Nakamoto said the victim was a man named Bruce Nichol, and he had died suddenly of what doctors thought was emphysema, which is a very serious lung disease. But Bruce's wife, Stella, did not believe that because Bruce had never been diagnosed with emphysema. So a couple of days after Bruce's death, when Stella saw the news about Sue and the Excedrin, she called the FBI saying her husband had died very mysteriously not long before Sue, and so maybe he had died from cyanide. Now, by this point, her husband Bruce had actually already been buried, but he had donated his eyes. So a vial of Bruce's blood had been taken to determine blood type, and then that blood had been stored at the blood bank. So the FBI sent that blood out for testing, and it would turn out it was positive for cyanide. Detective Dunbar didn't know what to say. After his trip to the bank, he'd convinced himself all over again that Paul must have been Sue's killer, retaliating that she was flirting and potentially cheating on him. But Bruce Nichol's death would mean that Paul killed 2 people, one of them 3 days before Sue. And so Dunbar wanted to go talk to Bruce's wife, Stella, to see if maybe there was some connection between Bruce and Sue. But Nakamoto stopped him and reminded Dunbar that the tampering angle was the FBI's case, and so Nakamoto would interview Bruce's wife Stella, and then he would tell Dunbar what he learned. The next afternoon, Special Agent Nakamoto arrived at the mobile home where Stella and her daughter lived. Stella opened the door and invited him into a small room that was dominated by a huge fish tank. Nakamoto sat down on the couch and watched Stella's brightly colored exotic fish dart back and forth. Stella watched him and told him she actually had a dream of opening up an exotic fish store of her own someday. Nakamoto smiled and said the fish were beautiful. Then, in a gentle voice, he asked Stella to please tell him what happened to her husband. But Stella said there really wasn't much to tell. Bruce had gone outside on the deck to get some fresh air, and then suddenly he collapsed. She said he had just taken a handful of Excedrin, and usually he took 4 pills at once. Nakamoto nodded and then asked Stella if she remembered where and when these pills had been purchased. Stella said she didn't, but Bruce saved all their receipts for tax purposes. So she got up and then quickly returned with a small box full of receipts. She said Nakamoto might have to dig a little bit, but she was almost positive he would find the receipt he needed. And so Nakamoto took the box, thanked Stella for her time, and then headed out the door. But as he walked outside, Stella's daughter, Cindy, pulled up in her car and got out, and unlike Stella, Cindy was furious. Nakamoto wasn't even down the steps before Cindy launched into a tirade, saying she couldn't believe the police were here questioning her family, like they would never hurt Bruce. Nakamoto tried to explain that, her mother, and Cindy for that matter, were not being treated like suspects here, but Cindy just cut him off and went from being angry to kind of sounding really heartbroken, and she said Bruce had died right when his life seemed to be turning around. She said Bruce had been an alcoholic, but he'd gone to rehab, he'd stopped drinking, and things had never been better. And then Cindy dropped her head into her hands and looked like she was crying, and Nakamoto just said, "Look, I'm only here to ask everybody questions. That's how we're going to figure out who killed Bruce." But Cindy just continued to cry and said it just didn't seem fair. It's like everything had been going so well for him. How could this happen? Nakamoto just said how sorry he was, and he told Cindy he would find the person who did this. Over the next few days, Nakamoto and his team tried to track down the source of the cyanide that was used to poison the Excedrin to see if they could figure out where the killer purchased it. Even though cyanide is obviously deadly, it's actually widely available. It's used in photography, jewelry making, drug manufacturing, and lots of other industries. And so quickly, the FBI realized that trying to track this down was kind of a dead end. There were too many places it could have come from. Meanwhile, the public pressure to solve the case was only intensifying. A group of drug companies whose stock had tanked following the Tylenol murders, and now also these Excedrin murders, put up a $300,000 reward for any information that led to an arrest. To Nakamoto, it seemed like whoever had poisoned the Excedrin was likely a local who was familiar with the grocery stores in the area. So he didn't think the murders of Bruce and Sue were related to the Chicago Tylenol murders. But he was absolutely certain that whoever killed Bruce also killed Sue, because an FDA lab had confirmed that the cyanide used in both murders had clearly come from the exact same source, even though they couldn't actually identify what that source was. In both of the tainted capsules, there were these strange green flecks all mixed in with the poison, which made it impossible to identify who manufactured the cyanide, but it was unique enough that it meant this was the same batch of cyanide. So by the end of June, 3 weeks after Sue and Bruce had died, even though Nakamoto and Dunbar had made progress on their cases, it just kind of felt like every avenue they had pursued had led to a dead end, with regards to actually figuring out who did this. Dunbar still thought Paul was the best suspect, but there was absolutely no evidence that Paul had killed Sue, much less Bruce, and so both investigations began to drag, and several months went by with no new leads. Dunbar and Nakamoto were getting more and more frustrated because they had both worked almost non-stop on their parallel cases, and both basically had nothing to show for it. In December of 1986, 6 months after the murders, Special Agent Nakamoto heard another agent calling his name from across the FBI command center. He waved Nakamoto over to take the phone. Nakamoto headed across the room, and despite the other agent's obvious excitement, Nakamoto tempered his expectations. Over the past several months, countless people had called into the hotline, but most of those tips had gone nowhere. Nakamoto figured most people were calling in a desperate attempt to try to cash in on the $300,000 reward those drug companies had offered. And so Nakamoto grabbed the phone and introduced himself, and right away the caller said they knew who had killed both Sue Snow and Bruce Nichol. Nakamoto exhaled, expecting another long-winded theory that really had nothing to do with the case, but as this caller explained how they knew who the killer was, a stunned look came across Nakamoto's face. This caller pointed to evidence leading to the killer that had been right in front of investigators, but they had overlooked it. Nakamoto ended the call and quickly rallied his team. He wanted them to follow up on the details this caller had provided. At this point, Nakamoto was sure that he had just figured out who Sue and Bruce's killer was. On a summer day in 1986, the killer put on a pair of gloves and then poured a vial of powdered cyanide into a bowl. Then they reached into a bag and pulled out an empty gel capsule. They opened it up, and then using one end, they scooped up the cyanide powder and then took the other end and closed the capsule back up, sealing the poison inside. On the table in front of them were a row of untampered-with Excedrin bottles. The killer picked up one of them, carefully removed the safety seal and lid, and then shook one uncontaminated capsule out into their palm. They then held it up to the cyanide pill they had just made. No one would be able to tell the difference. After replacing the cyanide pill in the bottle they had just opened up, they did the same thing with the other bottles, basically taking out a handful of good pills and replacing them with more cyanide pills. When the killer was done, they carefully glued the plastic safety seals back onto all of these now tampered-with Excedrin bottles and put the lids back on them. Then the killer put those tainted bottles in a shopping bag and walked out to their car. The killer drove to a grocery store, went inside, and headed for the pharmacy aisle. Once they were there, they looked around to make sure nobody was watching. Then they reached into their bag, pulled out a poisoned bottle of Excedrin, and placed it on the shelf with all the others, and it looked like it belonged there. Satisfied with their handiwork, the killer walked back outside. And then, just hours later, Sue Snow walked into that same grocery store and happened to buy that exact poisoned bottle of Excedrin that would kill her. But it would turn out the killer, who thought they had gotten away with it, had left behind one telltale clue. Those green flecks mixed in with the cyanide, the flecks that had baffled investigators and made it impossible to trace the source of the cyanide, well, it would turn out those flecks were dust from an algae pill used to keep the water clean in large fish tanks. And with that clue, Agent Nakamoto and his team came to realize that about a week before Sue ever stepped into that store, Stella Nichol had used tainted Excedrin to kill her husband, Bruce. Stella had crushed up the cyanide she had put in her husband's Excedrin in the same bowl she used to crush up the algae pills she used in her fish tank. And remnants of that algae showed up in samples of the tainted Excedrin. The tipster who had reached out to the FBI was Stella's own daughter, Cindy. It was Cindy who had at first insisted to Agent Nakamoto that nobody in her family would ever hurt Bruce, that they were the happiest they'd ever been since Bruce stopped drinking. But now, Cindy had a different story to tell. She said her mother, Stella, hated who Bruce had become after he quit drinking. Instead of getting dressed up and going to bars and hanging out with friends, Stella and Bruce now just stayed home all the time, and so Stella was bored. She missed her old life, and she felt like Bruce's new sobriety was holding her back. Cindy said Stella had even talked to her about how easy it would be to recreate the Chicago Tylenol murders and make it look like somebody had overdosed. Despite that, Cindy had tried to convince herself after Bruce's death that her mother's comments were just a weird coincidence. But then 6 months after the murders, Stella told Cindy she was going to use Bruce's life insurance money to live out her dream and open up a tropical fish store. And at this point, Cindy couldn't deny it anymore. She felt nearly certain that Stella must have killed Bruce for his money. Stella could have gotten away with this whole thing, but Bruce's autopsy didn't pick up the cyanide. Instead, the coroner listed Bruce's cause of death as emphysema. And that was actually a bad thing for Stella, because the life insurance policy she had on Bruce paid an extra $100,000 if his cause of death was accidental, i.e. cyanide, accidentally consumed cyanide, that's what she was hoping it would be, rather than emphysema, which is considered, a natural cause death, and so therefore would not be considered accidental. And so when Stella found out about this, she went back to the store with more cyanide pills because she needed another death, another cyanide death, to be able to have her own husband's cause of death reinvestigated. And Sue just happened to be the unfortunate victim who grabbed that bottle off the shelf that Stella had left. It would turn out Paul had nothing to do with Sue's murder. She was literally a random victim. Stella was arrested by the FBI and charged with 2 counts of causing death by product tampering. She was eventually found guilty and sentenced to 90 years in prison. Stella's daughter, Cindy, would receive $250,000 of that $300,000 reward the drug companies had offered. As for Sue's daughters, they received money in an out-of-court settlement with the drug manufacturer. They put it towards their college education, which is what they thought their mother would have wanted them to do.
Early on the evening of June 12, 2012, a 25-year-old woman named Noemi Bellanger opened up the door to her hotel room on Phi Phi Island, which is a major tourist destination in Thailand. Once the door was unlocked, Noemi pushed it open, and she held it for her little sister, 20-year-old Audrey, who came in wheeling all their suitcases. Noemi and Audrey were both from Quebec, Canada, and they were also both college students, and they were on this big month-long vacation to celebrate the end of the school year. They had been in Vietnam for the past 3 weeks, and today they had arrived in Thailand, and their plan was to stay here for a bit before finally heading back to Quebec. But for right now, Noemi in particular was feeling really exhausted. I mean, there was a lot of travel getting here today, and, the past 3 weeks had been loads of travel, and Noemi was kind of hitting a wall. And so as soon as she got into the room, all she really wanted to do was just flop down on the bed and just lay there for a little while. But she had also become a fairly experienced traveler by this point, and she knew before she did that, she just wanted to make sure that, the bed was cleanly, make sure there were no bed bugs or, unclean sheets or something. And so she went over and pulled the sheets back and checked, and the sheets were pristine. It was beautiful. The room felt super nice. And so she just flopped down on the bed and just enjoyed the air conditioning. And at the same time that she was doing this, Audrey, who very likely was also feeling all the symptoms of travel over so many weeks. I mean, she likely was very, very tired. But she, instead of laying down, went right into the bathroom and started getting ready for the night. And Noemi sort of understood why. So while the girls were in Vietnam, they had met these 2 really nice guys who were from Brazil, and they had kind of hit it off, and, they had left today to go to Thailand, and wouldn't you know it, it turned out those guys, their itinerary included them coming to Thailand today. And so it was kind of like this revelation at the end of their time in Vietnam that they would not have to say goodbye basically forever, but instead, the good times could keep on rolling in Thailand. And so the plan was that night they would meet up with these 2 guys, these Brazilian guys, out on the beach and basically party with them and just have a fun night. Now, Noemi was looking forward to this night out with these 2 guys, but she also had a little bit of apprehension about it. I mean, these guys were perfectly nice, and she and her sister had spent time with them in Vietnam, and really things had been fine. But, Noemi felt like Audrey was a little bit more naive and sort of like easier to be taken advantage of than she was. I mean, she was younger than her by 5 years. And also, when the sisters had gone on this trip, their parents had been really apprehensive about, 2 young women traveling alone together all over the world. I mean, they were sort of vulnerable. And so the way Noemi had sort of played it to her parents is, don't worry, I'm the big sister. I'll keep my eye on Audrey. She'll be fine. And Audrey kind of played the role of younger sister and was like, yep, I'll do what my big sister says. And so Noemi sort of felt like she had a responsibility to keep Audrey safe. And so she was feeling a bit apprehensive about whatever they were going to do that night with these guys. It just sort of seemed like things were sort of moving quickly with these two guys, They should have maybe just stopped in Vietnam, but they're here, and so who knows what was going to happen. And so Noemi, as she's laying there and Audrey's getting ready, Noemi decides to just give her parents a call. Because one of the things Noemi had been doing over the past several weeks they'd been on this big vacation is sort of constantly updating her parents to assuage their concerns that anything was wrong, with their two kids. Noemi wanted her parents to see that she was doing everything she could, to keep her and her sister safe. And so she pulled out her phone and she was about to call her parents when suddenly Audrey appeared from the bathroom and said, "Stop." And she told her, hey, remember, it's evening for us, but back home in Canada, it's the middle of the night, so you're going to be waking them up, and they're going to have loads of questions, like, why are you calling in the middle of the night? And probably you're going to have to tell them about, how we're going out tonight with these two guys, and they're going to worry. Don't do that. Spare them. We will talk to them tomorrow. They don't need to know what we're doing tonight. Everything is fine. And Noemi was thinking, you know what? She's right. This is a bad time to call. Noemi actually forgot, the time change was so significant. And she also, wasn't sure what she would say to her parents about, going out with these two guys because it would raise some red flags. And so Noemi put her phone down and decided, you know what? Tonight's going to be just fine. I just got to let things go. And so she actually climbed off the bed and she joined her sister in the bathroom and began also getting ready for their big night out. A little bit later, Noemi and Audrey left their hotel room and they headed out to the beach. And sure enough, there, right outside of a beachfront bar, were the two Brazilian guys they were meeting up with that night. And as the two girls approached, they saw that each of these guys were holding these big buckets. They almost looked like, a toy that a child would use on the sand, to fill it up and make a sandcastle with, like a big, beach bucket. And, the girls, as they're walking over, they're wondering what these buckets were for. And they thought it was maybe like some joke these guys were going to play, or they didn't know what. But as they got closer, they realized that these buckets these guys were holding were filled to the brim with ice and liquid. There was some sort of drink in these buckets. And so the girls walked up to them and they said hello. And very quickly, the conversation turned to these big drinks they were holding. And Noemi and Audrey were like, what are those? And the guys told them, these are like these amazing cocktails that you can only get in this part of the world. The girls asked, well, what is it? What's inside of the drink? What makes it so special? And the guys kind of looked at each other and laughed, and they're like, I don't know, just try it. It's really good. It'll make you feel great. Now, Noemi, being the sort of more responsible one, did not immediately begin drinking either of these drinks. Instead, she sort of paused and thought about it. But Audrey, on the other hand, was totally sold. She reached forward, grabbed one of the buckets, and just began chugging this drink. And so Noemi's looking at her like, come on, you can't just jump into this. We don't know what this stuff is. But, after a couple of chugs, Audrey lowered the bucket and looked at her sister and she just grinned and she handed it back to her guy. And then she told Noemi, these taste great. This is awesome. You gotta try it. Loosen up. And so at this point, Noemi, she's considering the situation. They were in Vietnam with these guys and these guys were out partying with them. They were drinking with them and, they seemed perfectly trustworthy and they were clearly drinking from these buckets and it didn't seem nefarious. And also, Noemi looked around the beach and suddenly realized that basically everybody had these big buckets, This was not just these two guys. Everybody's drinking this thing. And so Noemi's thinking, okay, well, if they think it's okay and it's sort of normal, in this part of the world, then it's got to be okay. And so she reached forward, grabbed the other bucket from the other guy, and took a big sip. Several hours later, well after the sun had gone down, Audrey and Noemi were having a great time with their Brazilian friends. They were still near this beachfront bar. They were actually dancing right outside of it because now there was a DJ blaring some music and there were all these people. And actually the sisters had sort of broken up and were sort of doing their own thing with their respective guy, but they were sort of near enough each other that they could kind of keep tabs on each other. And they were just having a great time. By this point, they had jumped in the ocean and gone swimming, they had eaten a ton of local food, and Noemi had lost count of how many of these big bucket drinks they had all consumed together. But they were really just having a blast. Noemi's vision was a bit blurry, and she was kind of stumbling, and she'd look over at Audrey, and she was kind of in the same state, as were the two guys they were with. They're buzzed, they're having a great time. And so the two girls and their guys are just out there dancing, doing their thing. It's about 1 a.m. at this point, and Noemi's guy says to her, "Hey, do you want to head back to the hotel room together?" And Noemi's like, "Yeah, let's go back. But hold on, I want to talk to my sister first." And so Noemi kind of stumbles her way over to Audrey, who's in the middle of this big dance routine with her guy, and she stops Audrey and she whips around, and Audrey's all smiles too. And Noemi's like, "Hey, do you want to go back to the hotel room? We're going back now. Do you want to come?" And Audrey's like, "No, I want to stay here. I'm having too much fun. This is awesome. We're just going to keep on dancing. You guys should stay too." But Noemi was like, "No, I got to go. We're going to go back. So you sure you want to stay?" And Audrey was like, "Yeah, we'll stay. We'll see you at the hotel soon." Now, typically, Noemi and her sister really rarely separated, especially when they were out drinking and partying, because of all the inherent risks of being alone at night, potentially intoxicated. And so, this was kind of a rare thing for her to break away from her sister and separate. But it just seemed like this was okay. It was safe. And, these guys they were with, they really seemed like stand-up guys. And again, they were just having a blast here. And Noemi didn't really want to stop her from having a good time. And so ultimately, she did say bye to her sister and said she'd see her soon. Noemi turned, and with her guy, she headed back to the hotel. And Audrey kept on dancing with her guy in front of the beach bar. 3 days later, on the evening of June 15th, a member of the housekeeping staff at the hotel where Noemi and Audrey were staying walked up to the girls' room and they knocked. And like it had been the past 2 days, they didn't get a response. Because over the past couple of days, the housekeeping staff had not seen anybody come in or out of this room. And now it had gotten to the point where they really had to get in there to clean the room. And basically, if they didn't get a response, this staff member was going to have to unlock the door and just go in there. And so one more time, they knocked on the door and called out, housekeeping, just in case somebody was in there. But again, there was silence. So the staff member put their card into the door, they unlocked it, they opened it up, and stepped inside. And seconds later, that staff member was literally running out of the hotel room, screaming for help. At 9 p.m. that night, a team of police officers, led by Lieutenant Colonel Rat Somboon, arrived at the hotel room. Somboon was an experienced police officer, and he'd already been briefed on what was found inside the hotel room. So when he and his team walked inside and saw it for themselves, he wasn't shocked. When they got in there, they found two women inside. It was Noemi and Audrey Belanger. And both of them were lying in their respective beds, tucked up in their sheets, lying perfectly still, and each of them was completely surrounded by vomit. Somboon estimated that these two women had been dead for between 12 and 20 hours, and his first theory as to what might have killed them was alcohol poisoning. That would explain the vomit. This was also a big tourist destination, and clearly these people were tourists, and so maybe they were out partying and they died from alcohol poisoning. However, when Somboon looked more closely at the bodies, he noticed a confounding detail. There was all this dried blood on the girls' gums and also under their fingernails. And so that was not consistent with alcohol poisoning. And so Somboon thought, okay, well, maybe the reason they have blood in these parts of their body is because those are defensive injuries. Maybe somebody attacked these girls and that's how they've been killed. But after doing a cursory check around the hotel room, there was no sign of a struggle or any sort of break-in or anything like that. And so, if there had been some sort of lethal struggle in here, it certainly didn't show. And so Somboon and his team really didn't have any idea what had happened here. They had some ideas, but clearly they needed more information. Specifically, they needed to do an autopsy and a full toxicology report on both women. That would be the only way to really see what happened here. But that would take time. And so while they waited for those results to come in, Somboon decided that what he would focus on instead is trying to figure out what these girls were doing in the hours before they died. Where were they? What did they eat? What did they drink? And who were they with? Over the next couple of days, Somboon and his team interviewed several of the hotel staff. And from those interviews, they learned that Audrey and Noemi were visiting Thailand from Canada. And on the first night they were here, the two women went out early in the evening, and then one of them came back with some guy, some unidentified man, at 1 a.m. They came back to the hotel. And then at 4 a.m., the other girl came back to the hotel, also with an unidentified man. And so there are Noemi and Audrey and these two unidentified men that are in the hotel room, presumably from 4 a.m. until 6 a.m., when both of these unidentified men left the hotel room together, and the two girls were presumably left inside the hotel room. Lieutenant Somboon reviewed some security footage from the hotel, which confirmed this entire timeline was correct, which meant Somboon really needed to speak to these two unidentified men because they clearly were the last ones to see these girls alive. And so the police department put out an announcement about Noemi and Audrey's deaths, as well as a public call for help in identifying these two unidentified men. And shortly after making this announcement, the police learned that these two men were Brazilian, and unfortunately, they had already left Thailand on their way back to Brazil. And so obviously Brazil is outside of his jurisdiction, and so he had to appeal to Interpol, which is an international police organization, and appeal to them to find these two Brazilian men and interview them. About a week later, Somboon finally got a call from Interpol. They had found these two men and they had interviewed them. And they told Somboon that when they informed these two guys that Noemi and Audrey had died, the two men seemed genuinely shocked. And then when they were asked, why were you so quickly on a flight out of Thailand back to Brazil? They said, no, there's nothing suspicious about it. We already had booked those tickets way in advance. We just got on the flight and left. There's nothing more to it. And so Interpol said they continued to press these guys and asked them, hey, you were the last ones who were with these girls before they died. Tell us about their condition. Tell us how you left them when you left the hotel at 6 a.m. And the two guys, they said, look, they did seem like maybe they were already hungover or sort of sick from, partying the night before. They definitely did seem a little bit down, but they were basically fine. However, Interpol said it was fairly interesting that the two men did admit that following, their night out with Noemi and Audrey, that the next 2 days, they were stuck in bed themselves, totally sick, vomiting, ill. They didn't know what from, but they said they were very, very sick following their encounter with these two girls. Somboon thanked the Interpol officer and then hung up. And even though Somboon couldn't help but feel still pretty suspicious of these two Brazilian guys, he now was thinking, okay, well, if they said they got really sick after, spending time with Noemi and Audrey, maybe what happened here is, all four of them got sick with something, some illness, and the guys survived it and the girls didn't. And so Somboon began to think of, what type of illnesses could they have contracted? And the first thing that Somboon began to think about that could have been an illness that all four of these tourists could have contracted was food poisoning. Tourists come to Thailand and try the local food, and sometimes it makes them really, really sick. In particular, there were two types of food in Thailand that were sort of notorious for giving tourists the worst food poisoning. One of them was a particular type of mushroom, and another was blowfish. And these two items, if your body reacted badly enough to them, it could be lethal. However, when Somboon got back the autopsy reports and the toxicology reports, he realized his theory about food poisoning was definitely wrong. So it would turn out those drinks that the girls had with the guys in those big buckets, they were unique to Thailand. Those are not drinks that are served really anywhere else in the world. And that's because those drinks are just not safe. And for whatever reason, it sort of blossomed in Thailand and it's sort of an accepted thing. But when you hear the ingredients of what's in this drink, you'll understand why it's not like a sanctioned or more popular thing outside of this small part of the world. So there is no alcohol in these big buckets of liquid. Instead, it includes crushed up narcotics, it includes cough syrup and Coca-Cola, and in some cases, pesticide. In fact, specifically DEET, which is the main ingredient in mosquito repellent. And wouldn't you know it, in the reports that Somboon got back, he saw both of these girls clearly had ingested DEET, which again is a highly toxic chemical. However, despite learning this, even though this seemed to be clearly what happened here, this is a DEET poisoning case, Somboon's thinking to himself, how could this have happened? I mean, these drinks, which are called 4x100s, are pretty popular in Thailand, and people are not just turning up dead left and right. It's a dangerous drink, no doubt, but, people do not die with any regularity from drinking it. And so Somboon thought, what must have happened here is whoever mixed this particular batch of 4x100s must have accidentally included too much DEET. And so that would explain how, the two girls died from DEET poisoning, too much DEET in their drinks, and that very likely the guys as well consumed the same batch, which had tons of DEET in it, but, their bodies were able to withstand it and they survived it despite getting very, very sick. And so 9 days after the two girls had died, their bodies were sent from Thailand back to Canada, along with the Thai police's official findings that this was an accidental DEET poisoning. However, when Noemi and Audrey's remains arrived in Canada, they did not go straight to their family. Instead, they went to a leading coroner in Quebec whose name was René Roussel. So by this point, the girls' parents were obviously heartbroken, but more than that, they were furious. The way they found out about the deaths of their daughters was on the media. Despite the fact that the police were immediately called when the girls were found dead, the Thai police did not get in touch with the family. They only got in touch after their investigation was done, and they're like, hey, by the way, your daughters are dead, and it was a DEET poisoning. It is what it is. Good luck. And so the parents felt like, are you kidding me? Like, you didn't loop us in at all? We're spending days trying to get in touch with our daughters, and you knew all along they were already dead? So the parents have no faith, no trust in the Thai police. And then to find out, wait a minute, so they drank this drink that apparently is sold at this beach bar all the time. And oh yeah, it killed them, no big deal. What, there's no warnings at this beach bar about how dangerous this drink is? Shouldn't there be like a tourist warning or something? And also, it's kind of a lazy explanation that, the two guys they were with drank the same poison, but they didn't die just 'cause, and our daughters did. That doesn't add up either. This whole thing feels like laziness, at best, or at worst, a cover-up. Maybe this looks really bad for Thailand that these tourists have died and it could have been prevented. And so the parents felt like, we can't just take their explanation at face value. Clearly, something is going on here. Something's wrong. And apparently, the Canadian government felt the same way as the parents. This case was all over the news, and they also felt like, wait a minute, guys, we haven't looked closely enough at this. What's really going on here? And so it was actually the Canadian government who told René Roussel to go ahead and do another autopsy on these girls' remains. Let's really see if it was DEET that killed them, or maybe if it was something else. And when René checked Noemi and Audrey's bodies, she did discover there was DEET in their system. However, not nearly enough to kill them. So while it seemed plainly obvious that yes, they must have consumed those 4x100 drinks, that couldn't have been the thing that actually killed them. However, René didn't find any other poisonous substances in these girls' bodies. There wasn't another explanation. It just showed there was DEET, but that was basically it. And so René, she's thinking there's gotta be some explanation here. And so René really began to do some serious research into this whole case, and eventually she found something. And it horrified her, it horrified the family, it horrified the world. It would turn out, from René Roussel's additional research, Noemi and Audrey were far from the first tourists to die this way in Thailand. Between 2009 and 2015, at least 20 tourists have been found dead under very similar circumstances. Now, René believed that what must have happened here is all these people, including Noemi and Audrey, must have been poisoned, but the common denominator did not appear to be food or drink. It had to be something else that was poisoning them, something that was damaging blood vessels that would account for the blood under the fingernails and the gums, but also metabolized so quickly that after death, this particular poison could not be detected. And René figured out she was correct. So when Noemi and Audrey first arrived in Thailand, they went to their hotel room, and one of the first things that Noemi did is she pulled back her sheets to check for bed bugs. She wanted to make sure her bed was clean before she laid down and relaxed. And when she looked, it appeared clean. And it was because the sheets were clean. They had actually just been treated for bed bugs, so there were no bed bugs. However, the way this hotel and other hotels, not just in Thailand, but in other parts of the world, the way they were treating for bed bugs was by spraying the sheets with pesticide, specifically phosphine gas, which is highly toxic to bed bugs, so it gets rid of the bed bugs, but it's also highly toxic to people. For reference, it is illegal to do this. You're not allowed to spray sheets with pesticide. And so based on all the evidence, it's believed that what actually happened to Noemi, Audrey, and the two Brazilian men they were with is that they climbed into those beds on the night they came back, And, the men were in there with them for some time, and all 4 of them were being exposed to this phosphine gas. It was going in through their skin, they were breathing it in, and they likely had no idea. And so they're getting sicker and sicker. And then finally, the 2 men, they get up out of the beds and they leave at 6 a.m. They've now been, totally contaminated by this poison, but not enough to kill them. So they go home, and over the next couple of days, they get really sick from their exposure to this gas. But Audrey and Noemi, they didn't leave their bed. They stayed in those beds all night. And unfortunately, as they laid there, their bodies continued soaking in all of this poison, and their bodies just could not handle it. And so it eventually killed them. But despite learning this, and despite the fact that clearly something illegal was done here, you cannot spray your bed sheets in a hotel with pesticide to get rid of the bed bugs. It's incredibly hazardous. You can't do it. Despite that, to this day, no one has been held accountable for these girls' deaths.
We talk all night like we're something, but daylight calls it nothing. You hold my hand in the dark, then let it go when it's morning. You say my name like you mean it, but never say what we're in. It's like we're almost a feeling that you don't wanna begin. And I'm tired of guessing games. If it's real, why won't you say?
Static crawling round the room. It smells like magic, cold sweat skin, I feel it coming. In the lantern glow, your eyes witches. You came looking for truth, but you just found trouble. Your memories are cracking, and I'm chewing through the rubble. Future sight, I don't think I can save you in time. Ruined city in the
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.